Hey, good morning. If I haven't gotten a chance to meet you this morning, my name's Dan Kohler. I am the lead pastor here. So I'm just excited for what we have ahead of us this morning. Honestly, I do think if you chose today as your first day to visit with us and check us out, it's a really good time to do that. The course of this next month is really going to be focusing in on the reality of who God is. And so it's going to be a really good month for you to bring your curiosities and your questions, not just about God in general, but about God in practical experience. We're going to be talking about encountering God, and specifically through the person of Jesus. And here's what I believe you can expect over the course of this month. This is for anybody who is in the room. It is this. It's that I believe that God wants to encounter you. We're going to talk more about that. I believe that God will encounter you, but I believe that encounter might be different than you've heard about or have seen. I think something that we're going to see marks all of the stories of encounter with Jesus over the course of this month. You're going to see a common theme, and that is the gentleness of God. And I think that the Lord is doing something in the world around us as he gives people encounters that could only be characterized by gentleness. It's not like this violent taking over. It's not always this overwhelming thing. It's a gentle encounter. And I think that's what's in store for anybody who wants it over the course of this month. That's pretty cool, all right? So I've talked about it a little bit from stage before. Some of you know, Janine and I, for just over 5 years, almost 6 years, we did foster care when we lived in Michigan. And one of the things that we learned doing foster care was that you have to meet the needs of the kids pretty early on. They're coming out of this whirlwind of crisis and trauma that they've been living through, but also in what they're experiencing right in that moment. And many of those kids were just taken out of their house, and now they're being put in a stranger's house. Like, how crazy is that? And so we learned pretty early on, even going into our very first foster care placement, that we needed to be like gentle and loving and get down in the kids like on their level and provide for them. And I remember like kneeling down to one of the first foster kids that we had, and I got down in his face, and I wanted to just remind him that he is safe, and we are here for him. And I got down in his face. I was like, buddy. And that's as far as I got, because he ran off. But, most of the time, the encounters went pretty well. We learned, and Janine would oftentimes prepare like as simple as a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for the kids, and they would want to eat first thing. Because, again, one of the things we learned is they're not going to feel safe until their needs are met. And it kind of goes back to this whole thing. Maybe some of you have heard it, whether you've worked with kids or trauma or just psychology. There's this theory called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs essentially lays out this pyramid, because pretty much everything we do in any theory is going to be put into a pyramid of some sort. And so it's this pyramid, and at the base of the pyramid is basic needs. At the top of the pyramid is self-actualization, meaning you have a healthy sense of identity. And then it just kind of builds from there. The base of the pyramid is having your needs met, and then it goes toward maybe some other provisional things. And near the top are the things that we often value around your identity and your performance on all of those things. But those are at the top of the pyramid. At the bottom is just having your basic needs met. It's, do you have clothing? Do you have shelter? Do you have food? If you can't meet those needs, there's not going to be any level of trust that can be built after that. And that's not just true for the experiences that we had. I think that's true for all of us. When we have need, we are actually really, really hungry to have those needs met. And if there's going to be trust or there's going to be relationship, it's going to be after the fact that some level of our needs is met. If we're in crisis and we have a need that is has not been met, then there's no point in moving on from there. Our needs actually matter a great deal, whether we're considering them or not. Now, here's what I think is some really good news. I think that the person who made you, the person of God, he knows that. He knows your needs, and he's willing to meet you exactly where you are. And we're going to find that out when we go to a story about an encounter with Jesus this morning. I'm going to be reading out of a biography of Jesus by a guy named Luke. Luke was a doctor. We're going to be in Luke chapter 17. If you have a Bible and you want to follow along, we're going to be in Luke chapter 17, starting at verse 11. We're also going to have it on the screen up above, or you could download the Bible app on your phone and follow along there. That's an easy one as well. But just a little background on Luke. Luke is a doctor. He's kind of a Greek-Roman doctor. He's not Jewish. Most of the people around Jesus were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. But Luke wasn't. In fact, Luke wasn't one of the direct followers of Jesus. He kind of came down the line. And what Luke decided to do was he decided to write a biography of Jesus. And in order to do that, he went and spent a lot of time with followers of Jesus who had spent a lot of time with Jesus while he was on the earth. And then he also interviewed people that he couldn't spend time with, so he went along and he collected eyewitness interviews. And he did all of this information gathering, and then he kind of laid it out. And so what you find in this biography from Dr. Luke is that it's very meticulous. Because he was a doctor, he was very more orderly in his writing. And so he set this out, and he wrote it for a person named Theophilus, who was a higher-up person in Roman society. And he was curious about the things of Jesus. And so Luke set out this biographical work in order to help Theophilus understand who Jesus was. And this is really just part one. If you flip through your Bible, you'll get to a book called the Book of Acts. Luke wrote that as well. It's kind of like a 2-volume set. One is the biography of Jesus. The other is kind of the biography of the early movement following Jesus. It's fascinating if you haven't read it. So Luke collects all of these stories, and he translates them, and he puts them in a specific order to communicate a truth about Jesus. And if that seems weird, every biography does that. Every story that we've ever told omits some parts of the story and includes others because we're always trying to get at a point with our story, aren't we? Luke does the same thing. And the story that we're about to read has an incredible, beautiful, subtle point to it, okay? We start reading in verse 11 as Luke writes. Now on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go, show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except for this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Now, this is a story, again, that's just characterized by the gentleness of Jesus. When we come into the description that Luke gives about what Jesus is up to, there's this narrative point. Some of your Bibles will have black words and red words. The red words signify in the biographies of Jesus or throughout Scripture the words that Jesus spoke. And the black words are commentary. It's the narrative. And so Luke is giving us narrative. And he says that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and he's traveling between 2 cities. He's traveling between Samaria and Galilee. Now there were, just like there are today, there's roads that go through the city and roads that go around the city, and Jesus goes around the city. Now this is significant because the roads that went around the city, you'd find different things and encounter different people than you would going through the city. And that's exactly what we have here. We read in verse 12, as he was going into a village, okay, he's going into some village between Samaria and Galilee, he encounters a few men. 10 men who had leprosy met him. Now all of this is kind of coming together. We just mentioned that on the outskirts of town, you'd find different things than you would find in town. One of those differences would be people with leprosy. Now, nobody was really trying to be cruel to people with leprosy. However, people with leprosy, which didn't just define what we understand as modern-day leprosy, but it kind of covered a whole host of communicable skin diseases. And so anything that was contagious that they didn't have a cure for, that was on your skin, they just kind of referred to it as leprosy. And if you had leprosy, you weren't allowed to stay in the city. You had to go to the outskirts of the city, and whenever somebody passed you by, you had to cover your face and you had to yell, "Unclean," all right? Now, again, nobody was really trying to be demeaning toward people with leprosy, and unfortunately, oftentimes it still was demeaning. However, what they were trying to do was just provide people with warning, don't get too close to that person, because giving alms, giving charitably to people was a high value in the ancient world. And so they might approach people to give beggars some money. But they also needed to be protected from catching this disease, right? And so the lepers would have to stand off at a distance, and they would just cover their faces and they'd shout unclean. And they had to stay outside of the city. They had to leave their business, they had to leave their family until the skin condition cleared up. And all of this was wrapped up in religious practice. It was the religious leaders that they would see. You might go to one of the religious leaders and you'd show them the spot on your skin. And they'd declare it whether it was in line with leprosy or outside of leprosy. And there were a whole list of tests that had to happen. They had to look for specific things. It was like the religious leaders, the priests of the time, kind of acted as the health inspectors for people. And they would declare them clean or unclean. Unclean meant they had to go outside of the city. And that's exactly where we find this group of 10 lepers that are standing at a distance, we read in verse 12. We read, they stood at a distance and they called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." Now, by all social dealings, the lepers are doing what they're supposed to do. They're staying off at a distance. You know, what's interesting is kind of what follows. We read in verse 14, when he saw them, that's when Jesus sees them, he says, "Go show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were cleansed. Now we have like a really quick bit of the story that seems to be happening here. We have this group of 10 lepers. They're doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're staying off at a distance. They're outside of the city. And they see Jesus and they shout to him, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." Now, have pity on us, that really is, they're not just asking for somebody to feel bad for them, right? How many of you in that sort of a scenario would be like, "Hey, would you just identify with me? Like, would you just feel what I'm feeling right now?" No, they call Jesus by his name, and they're asking for pity from him. This lets us know a couple things. Number one, it lets us know that they knew Jesus' name, right? They're at a distance. They haven't talked with, they haven't had introductions. They haven't said, "Oh, hello, my name is Simon. What's your name?" "Oh, Jesus. Would you mind having pity on us?" Right? That's not like the exchange that we see. They're at a distance, and they know who Jesus is. That means that they've either seen him acting in his ministry. Remember, we're at chapter 17 of this account of Jesus, which means there's a whole lot of chapters that have gone before and have kind of laid out what's happening in the life and ministry of Jesus. In the midst of that, there's healings, and there's people talking about the healings. There's demons that are going out of people because of Jesus' ministry, and people are talking about that. There's teachings that Jesus has done. People are talking about that. So at the very least, this group of lepers standing off at a distance, they know what Jesus is about. They know what he's capable of, and they call out to him, and they're asking for pity. Not just that Jesus would feel sorry for them, but that Jesus would interact with them, that Jesus would do something, that he would help them in the midst of their situation. So here's what's going on. The lepers, they have this need, don't they? And the only thing they can see is their need. Needs are incredibly self-centered. Needs, especially pain, especially hurt, especially trauma. These are very narcissistic things. Now hear me clearly. I'm not saying that people who experience them are narcissistic. I'm saying that the need itself is narcissistic. It demands our attention and is very good at it. If you've ever had a crisis or a need, like, it's hard to think outside of that crisis or need. It demands all of your attention and it sucks you in. And that's what's happening with the lepers. They look at Jesus, they've heard about him, and they call out to him, and they say, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us. Do something about our need. Will you meet our need? We have a problem. Will you fix it? We've heard you can fix it. Will you fix it?" And then Jesus, we read, when he saw them. Now this could signify something. It could signify maybe that Jesus hadn't seen them until they shouted out. They're at a distance. There might be a lot of people around, and maybe Jesus didn't take note of this one specific group. But I think more is going on. Like, if you read about Jesus, you find out something very quickly about him. He knows things he shouldn't know. He's aware of things that other people aren't aware of. He can do things other people weren't able to do. Even on like just a very human level, I think Jesus was, if not the smartest, at least one of the smartest men who ever lived. My guess is Jesus saw them. My guess is Jesus saw the group of lepers at a distance. But it wasn't until they called out to him that he responds to them. And I think if you pay attention to the other stories of Jesus, you're going to see this. That Jesus was willing to do and meet needs. He was willing to interact with people who came to him. But very few times did he just go to them. That makes me wonder why. Okay, so there's this guy named Jesus. He's incredibly intelligent. He's smart. He sees things. He knows things. And he's capable of fixing the problems in these lepers' lives. Yet they're the ones that call out to him. Why? Why does that happen? Why do they have to wait off at a distance and shout to Jesus, and then he responds to them? Why does that happen? And then even more than that, we're going to sit with that question. We're not even going to answer it right now. We're going to sit with that why, because there's another why that pops up. In verse 14, Jesus' response to them is not the same as other times he responds to people when they ask for healing or they ask for him to meet one of their needs. Like when you read other stories of encounter with Jesus, you read things like Jesus would go and there was one girl that he just takes her by the hand and she was dead, but he takes her by the hand and she gets up. That's how he did that one. There was another man that he couldn't see, and so Jesus spits in his eyes. There's another guy, he spits in the mud, and he makes like this cake of mud, and then he wipes it in the eyes of the gentleman. And then there's other people that he just speaks to, and he says, it's happened according to your faith, go. Like, there's no formula with Jesus. I think sometimes we want to look at the stories of Jesus and try to get out this sort of formula where A plus B always equals C. But with Jesus, if C is the miracles and the encounter of Jesus, A plus B might equal C, but so does A plus E, and sometimes F plus G equals C. It's just all over the place. Jesus only sometimes works the same way twice. Oftentimes, it's very different from one moment to another. And so we can't find this formulaic approach to encountering Jesus. In this case, we find something incredibly different. When they ask for pity, when they ask for Jesus to meet their need, Jesus doesn't do anything to them. He doesn't touch them. He doesn't pray for them. He doesn't command anything. All he does is he says this, go show yourselves to the priests. Well, I don't know about you, but if I were in that situation and I said, Jesus, my master, you're the master, will you just have pity on me? And somebody's like, yeah, go talk to the priest. I think, I don't know if I was right about you. I don't know if you're the person I thought you were going to be. I would have some questions and some thoughts in my mind, just like the question of why does Jesus wait until they approach him? I would have another question. Why does Jesus say, go and show yourselves to the priests? Now, we just mentioned that the priests kind of acted like health inspectors, and they declared things unclean or clean. Clean meant you could interact and worship just like everybody else. Unclean meant you had to remove yourself because something was wrong, okay? And so if they were healed, if Jesus had laid his hands on them, and he had done that for lepers before, okay? But if Jesus had done it that way, that same exact way, they would have gone and showed themselves to the priests anyway. That was how they operated. If you wanted to gain entrance back into society after you were ceremonially unclean and sick, and you had to be outside the city walls, then to come back into the city, your first person you needed to go talk to was to get a clean bill of health from the priest. But Jesus doesn't heal them. He just says, go and show yourself to the priests. Interestingly, then we read, as they went, they were cleansed. As they went, they were cleansed. What's going on there? I appreciate scholar and commentator Leon Morris. He gives us a little bit of clarity into what's going on. He says this, Jesus was putting the lepers, faith to the test by asking these men to act as though they had been cured. And as they obeyed, so it happened. Well, that's different. That's different. That's different than how Jesus has operated a lot of times. Jesus, according to Leon Morris, who's a pretty smart dude, he says, listen, Jesus isn't just trying to play games. Jesus is actually testing something out. Now, I've had plenty of moments in my life where I've thought, if this happens, then I will do this. Right? Life is filled with ifs and thens. It is. If I had more money, then I would be more generous. If I had more time, then I would do that. If I had the money, then I would go travel, or my family could do this. If this, then that. There's even moments, I think, in our lives where we have made silent vows to the Lord, where we say, God, if you would do this, then I would believe. God, if you would do this thing first, then I'd be on board. Now, I don't know. I really don't. And I can suspect, and I have some assumptions that I make about what I read about this in the story of Jesus. But I have an assumption that I'm making right now, especially in light of what this scholar, Leon Morris, says about the test of faith. Would they believe? So I have this assumption, this hunch, that the lepers, as they watched the master, Jesus, they've heard all these stories about him, they have this thought, I'll believe he's the master if he can heal my leprosy. Then I'll know he is who he said he is. I suspect that's what, I don't know, but I suspect that's what's going on in the heart of most of these men that are lepers and they encounter in Jesus. They have this need and they think, if you could just meet my need, then I will believe. And we get that. We want our needs met. We want to feel safe and secure. And Jesus kind of turns that whole thing and he says, okay, do this first. Just go show yourselves to the priests. And I'm sure they're thinking, as soon as they hear this, they're thinking, wait a second, last time I went to the priest, he declared me unclean. I'm still a leper. What are you talking about? But the crazy thing is, they do it. Jesus says, go show yourself to the priest, and as they went, they were cleansed. That means that they actually did it. Regardless of their misgivings, regardless of their confusion, they listened to Jesus. Now, it doesn't say it right here. It might say it in just a moment. But we've talked about this before, and we've called what we just see happening here in this story with the lepers, that's faith. I think sometimes we assume that faith is just an intellectual belief. It's an agreement that we make. It's something that we accept as true. That's not faith. Faith is responsiveness. So at some level, all 10 of these men, when Jesus tells them to go show themselves to the priest, they respond in faith, and they go. And as they go, they're healed. Now, I would think that's pretty incredible. If I'm just being honest, what we're about to read, I'd probably be in the majority of the 10 in this story. If I turned and I went to tell the priest, and I was healed, and you could feel it in your body, right? You could see it in your body. They're wondering, like, what's happening? And they're probably feeling this change. If it was true leprosy, the pain would start to ease. Then they might start to have feeling entering back into parts of their body that they had no feeling. Like, this is something that it was a verifiable thing. They knew they were being healed. And so if I were in that group, if I were one of the 10, I probably would have been among the 9 who, as they're being healed, they probably started running faster without any fear of feet or hands falling off. They probably started running faster to the priest to get verified and to get back into society and back with their loved ones, to just be a person with value and to be around others again. But for one person, it's a little bit different. For one, something else happens. If we continue reading in verses 15 and 16, we read this. One of them, when he saw he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. So one of the 10, he's realizing he's been cleansed, he's realizing he's been healed, and he turns and he books it back to Jesus. Just as fast as the others are going to be declared clean, he turns, and on the way back, he starts thanking God, he starts praising God, and then he falls down at the feet of Jesus. Now, there's been a lot of people who would say, if you read the stories of Jesus, he never claims to be God. He never outright in a way that we would understand. But I just want to point something out really quickly. This man, right, this leper, when he comes back and he's praising God and he's thanking Jesus, and he falls down at the feet of Jesus to worship him, he's doing something for us. He's showing us the connection between God and Jesus. His worship and praise and thanks to God and falling down at the feet of Jesus are synonymous, and in his action, he's combining the two into one. He's recognizing that the encounter he had with the miraculous power of God happened through the person of Jesus, and they are one and the same. He's making it clear for us. He's seeing maybe even what the other 9 didn't see. Only one returns. And we read that he was a Samaritan. Now, we read at the beginning that Jesus was kind of skirting around the city of Samaria. And these guys were kind of on the outskirts of Samaria. Maybe they were from Galilee as well. But there's something we need to be aware of. And that's that Jewish people like Jesus and Jesus' followers, they had bad blood historically, like generational feuds with Samaritans. At one point in time, Israel split into 2 kingdoms, and the capital of the lower kingdom had always been, the capital of Israel had always been Jerusalem. And when they split into 2 halves, the southern half, they took Jerusalem. They stayed in Jerusalem. That continued to be their capital. The northern kingdom, they got pretty unfaithful pretty quickly with other nations, and they started kind of having this syncretistic views of religion and other gods, and they set up Samaria as their capital. And so they had this whole bad blood around where should we worship? Should it be in Samaria or should it be in Jerusalem? And they became really, really not great. I don't know, is anybody a Harry Potter fan? Yeah? This is kind of like the purebloods and the mudbloods, okay? You get me now? Yeah. Purebloods and mudbloods, that's what's going on here. The Samaritans were the mudbloods. They were the partial mixture. They were the abomination. They were not God's true and pure people. That was from Jerusalem. Jesus himself, he would be representative from Jerusalem, and the only leper that comes back with a confession that Jesus is who he says he is, that he has the power of God, that he is the power of God, that he is worth thankfulness and worship, is a Samaritan. These two shouldn't even be together. These two shouldn't even be encountering one another. These two should be actually fighting, because they have for generations. They fought literal wars against each other. And now we have them together. Now we have them recognizing, we see the Samaritan recognizing and confessing who Jesus is. Now he's not just asking for a need to be met, but he's falling down and he's offering all of his thanks and praise, not just to God, but to God through Jesus. This is a significant moment. It's a significant moment because we're going to continue reading something, and for this one individual, something unique happens. So as he throws himself at Jesus' feet and he thanks him, we read this in verse 17. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Again, foreigner synonymous with Samaritan. In verse 19 we read, "Then he said to him, 'Rise and go, your faith has made you well.'" So we get this. All 10 were healed. I think some people have asked the question before reading this passage, does that mean just one person was healed? No, all 10 were healed. All 10 had their need of healing met. Every single one did. But only one came back and gave thanks to God. Only one person came back and fell at Jesus' feet and thanked him. Now, this isn't about Jesus needing notoriety. This isn't about Jesus needing thanks. If Jesus wanted just affirmation of who he was, or if he just wanted worship from people, he wouldn't have healed so many people and then turned around the next minute and said, "Don't tell anybody about what just happened." Like, that's not how you build a following. That's a really bad way to build a following. Jesus told tons of people, "Don't tell people what I just did." But now we read this, that he's being thanked, and the purpose is he's not looking for praise from this individual. He's looking for a response. He's looking for something more. I love meeting my kids' needs, but I love it even more when they just sit with us. Like when we're on the couch and they just kind of cuddle up to us, that's just the most special thing. Like some of my best memories are just being with my parents. And it was just pure, and it was just good, and it was just gentle. I liked when they gave me things too, but more than that, I needed to feel their love, and they needed to feel my love, and that's my favorite part of being a parent as well. I think we see a little bit of kind of like a father heart from Jesus here. He's happy to meet the needs of the lepers because he loves them. But there's something special for those who are willing to get up close to him and be with him. Jesus isn't looking for thanks and praise. Jesus is looking just to be with the people. He's looking for them just to encounter one another in the most gentle way. And at the end we read this: "Rise and go, your faith has made you well." Rise and go, your faith has made you well. Now, we're not talking about the healing of the leprosy. That's already happened. Remember, like, as soon as all 10 left, they got healed. Jesus isn't now declaring a healing over his leprosy. There's something deeper that's going on in this leper's heart and soul. Again, Leon Morris helps us kind of bring some clarity to it. He says this: "It may be that Jesus recognized in this man the faith that issues in salvation, and so he sent him off with the assurance that it was well with his soul as it was with his body." Now catch this. Full restoration means a saved soul as well as a sound body. You know, again, with my kids, I know when they have needs, but I know what the deeper needs are. I know that I could give them all of the food or all of the clothing that they could ever want, but I know what happens to an individual who grows up without the relationship and nurture from a family. I know there are deeper needs, but sometimes they won't let us get to those needs until we meet the more basic needs. You remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs? We can't get to the emotional needs until we meet the basic needs, and I think that's exactly what we see with Jesus here. I think we see Jesus meeting the need of somebody who can't see beyond the need so that he can get to the greater need, and that's the restoration of the whole person. Here's what I believe. I believe all 10 went away healed, but I think one became fully alive. That's what I think the difference is. That's what I think Leon Morris is saying. That's what I think Jesus is saying. Rise and go, your faith has made you well. I think Jesus isn't talking about the cleansing from leprosy. I think he's talking about the restoration and the resurrection that's happening in this guy's heart. I think he's talking about what happens when you have a true and beautiful and gentle encounter with Jesus. Now, here's what I believe we can learn about encounters with Jesus. I think we can learn something incredibly crucial that we need to hold on to about encounters, and it's this. Encounters with Jesus, encounters sometimes follow obedience. Encounters sometimes follows obedience. And we need to grasp that. That Jesus is absolutely willing to meet our needs. He's going to be going after a greater need. But if you really want an encounter with God, sometimes when we try to make it formulaic, we don't always see it. Sometimes that encounter with God follows obedience. We think just the meeting of the need is going to be the encounter with God, but there's 10 that have a partial encounter with Jesus, but there's one that has a true, deep, life-changing encounter with Jesus. And it comes from response. It comes from true obedience. Not just obedience to go and show himself to the priest, but he comes back and he throws himself at the feet of Jesus and he receives more. See, I think Jesus is very, very generous. I think sometimes, though, he's looking at us to see whether we're going to allow our needs to be the thing that we're just satisfied with our needs being met. I think, and we're going to get to it in a moment, I think there's a truth there that Jesus is willing to work with. But I think there's also a greater reality. And sometimes that reality can't be encountered until we enter into it in obedience. Now I think all of us at some level, regardless of what you believe, how you feel about the Bible or Jesus or the church or Christians, regardless of how you feel about that, here's something I believe is true for all of us. We want an encounter that transcends our understanding. I think we want an encounter with divinity that is transformative. And I think Jesus is willing to give you that. In fact, if that's you, if that's what you're after, I want to give you a few things to hold on to this morning. Some of them are going to be actionable. Some of them you just need to be remembering. That if you really want that kind of encounter, this is for you to grab hold of. First, it's this. Jesus actually does. Jesus wants to encounter you. Now I'm saying that very specifically. I don't think Jesus wants you to encounter him. I think Jesus wants to encounter you, and here's why I think that. Because Jesus was walking into the city, and he more than likely saw people outside, and he probably recognized that some of them were shouting, "Unclean," and they were off to the side, and Jesus was more than aware that the power was in him to change their reality, wasn't it? Yet Jesus waited for them to encounter him. Jesus was more than happy just to walk along and give them the space that they wanted. Now, I've had moments in my life where I felt distance from God. I've had many moments in my life where I felt God is so far away. And when I get out of that place, I've realized that all along I was the one that created the distance. Here's the truth. I think all of us are like the lepers in this story. I think we're all lepers to some level. And here's what I believe. That just as much as Jesus wants to encounter you, he's not the one creating the distance. I think many of us go through life with our faces down and our eyes down, and we're filled with shame, even though we don't always want to admit it, right? We don't like the idea of somebody saying that we're shameful because we're not shameful, but we feel shame. And so I think we allow moments like that or thoughts about ourselves or feelings that God is so good and I don't feel like I can have access to Jesus. I think that's the same distance that the lepers put between themselves and Jesus. And because I think Jesus shows us the heart of God because he is God, I think that God's heart is so gentle and so honoring to you that he's willing to let you have the distance you want. But here's what I believe is true. He wants an encounter with you. My guess is if you think back through your life, you've probably had many moments where you feel like God's just a few feet away, that there's a distance between you and him, like you almost had a brush and you can see him and you're aware of him, but you thought, why is there that distance? Well, one thing I know is true about Jesus is he never went somewhere where he wasn't invited. The religious leaders were incredibly upset about Jesus eating with tax collectors, prostitutes, and sinners. But guess who invited Jesus over to dinner? The tax collectors, prostitutes, and sinners. And guess who didn't invite Jesus over to dinner? The Pharisees. Jesus will go where he's invited. I think it's true that Jesus saw the lepers, but if they had never cried out to him, he would have been honoring to them and giving them their space. But I do think Jesus wants to encounter you. And to encounter you, you have to be the one that calls out. He will always be right there. He's always going to be just a little ways away, waiting to see if you're going to call out. So the first step of encounter is truly accepting that Jesus wants to encounter you. He's looking for you. He's probably going to take the road that goes around the city, even though the road through the city might be more direct, so that you have a chance to cry out to him. But he'll always leave it in your court to close the distance. He wants to encounter you. He's looking for you. He's going out of his way to find you. He wants that encounter. I think every bit as much as we want that encounter, we have to hold on to the reality that Jesus wants the encounter. Secondly, here's what I believe. I believe that in an encounter, Jesus will meet your need. Right? Jesus knows how we work. God knows how we work, and he will meet your need. When I was in high school and the beginning of college, I was a pole vaulter. That's all I did. I wasn't fast enough to do anything else. I could never run like that. The reason I didn't sprint was because even 100 meters was too long, okay? So I didn't do any other events in track other than pole vaulting, and I was pretty good at that. So I did pole vaulting, and in pole vaulting, I met this guy named Orrin Mitchell, and he's passed since I was in high school, but he was an older gentleman, and he would show up at our invitationals and tournaments and meets. And he would show up just to coach people, which I thought was incredible because I had heard of Orrin Mitchell before. Even though he was a Michigan native, he was known all around the country. In fact, he had even been an official in Atlanta, Georgia at the Summer Olympics, and he was watching and judging the pole vault. He was that caliber. He put on one of the biggest national open invitationals to pole vaulting on the beach every summer in Michigan, where they would set up pits and any age could come and compete, and they would just pole vault on the beach. And then he ran summer camps all summer long in his back. He transformed his house to be a coaching place of pole vaulting. And people came from all around the country to get Orrin Mitchell's coaching. He was that caliber of coach. He was the best alive at the time. And he would show up just to our meets. And he would just impromptu coach us. I had never met the guy before, and he came up and he started giving me advice, but I knew who he was. And so I remember I got a little bit better because he just spent that one time in that tournament with me, and he helped me do better that day. And so I had some follow-up conversation with him. I said, Mr. Mitchell, could I just ask you a question? Like, how high did you pole vault? And he was like, oh, well, I can't pole vault. He said, I've actually never pole vaulted a day in my life. I said, well, how are you so good at coaching? He said, here's what I understood. I actually really love young men and women. And he meant it from not a creepy place, but like a really pure place, okay? Like he really wanted to invest in the lives of young adults, young people. He had a genuine love for them to help them become better. And he knew that he had nothing to offer young people, and in order to get into their lives, he had to have some kind of a skill. Well, he started hanging around somehow. He got connected with people in pole vaulting, and he found out he actually really understood the concepts, even though he couldn't do it with his body. And so he started getting really, really good at coaching and realized that if he could meet that need in young people's lives, then he could have a relationship with them. And it worked. He got to invest in a lot of young people's lives. He got to help them become better than they would have been without him in their lives. Here's what I think. Despite the fact that our needs can sometimes overwhelm us and make us blind to other things, I think Jesus will still meet your need. Why? Not because he just wants to meet the need, but because he wants to invest deeper in your life. I think he's looking to buy trust with you, just like Orrin Mitchell needed to buy trust in the lives of young people by offering them a skill, and a very high-end skill. Jesus is willing to buy your trust. He is willing to meet your need. But not just meet your need, he wants to do so much more. He doesn't just want to meet the need like the 9 had their need met. He wants you to come back and be like the 1. He wants it to be a life-changing thing. Not because he's so much higher and better than you are, but because he has a love that you and I need access to. And I think we actually long for. We might not always have the words for it, but it's what we're looking for. And Jesus is willing to meet your need, but he wants so much more for you. Here's my challenge to you. I think encounters with God are actually relatively easy to come by. I think if you will give Jesus the time and space, he'll give you the encounter. Encounters are easy to come by. Encounters are easy to come by, but don't let yourself get stalled out at that one encounter with Jesus, because I think he has more for you. Don't let the meeting of the need be the end of the encounter. Come back to him and realize that he just bought your affection. He'll meet your need, but he wants to meet you in so much more. It's not enough for him that you just have a healing. He wants to help you come alive and live life to the fullest. Jesus said to his followers, the thief, he's referring to the enemy and to the proponents of just this staunch religious practice around him. He said that the thieves, they come to steal, kill, and destroy. But I come that they might have life and have it abundant, full life. That's what a true encounter with Jesus looks like. He's happy to let you have your distance, but if you're willing to cry out to him and see beyond that need, to let him meet your need, but to do so much more, it's going to be life-changing. And then we have one final thing that I want you to understand, and it's this. I want to ask you to trade your if for action. And we talked about many times we come to God, and I believe we come to God many times in a last resort sort of way. And it's always this if-then scenario. God, if you will do this, then I will do this. But what if Jesus is waiting just close enough to where you can see him? And you really have to watch out for him, because otherwise you might miss him. Your need is going to make you a little bit blind sometimes to what's going around. And you understand, you need to understand that Jesus wants to encounter you. He wants to meet your need, but he also might sometimes cause you to do something that seems a little bit backwards, where we want to say, God, I'll trust you if you do this thing. And Jesus says, no, actually what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to do this thing, and then you're going to have the encounter of your life. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes the encounter follows obedience. And you might not understand it. So here's my challenge to all of you. If you want to encounter Jesus, sometimes you're only going to encounter him when you take the step toward him. I think some of us have been asking God, would you just overwhelm me with your presence? He's like, listen, my presence is always here. What I'm waiting for you to do is come to me. I'm waiting for you to do simply what I asked you to do, and not in a rule-following way. I'm not talking about following the rules. What I'm doing is, some of you, I think, have a hunch that God has asked you to do something in response to him. It might have just been showing up to church today. It might have been an act of generosity. It might have been an act of just serving somebody or striking up a conversation with somebody that you don't even know. Maybe God wants to meet you in that moment. But until you do, you won't have the encounter. I want to ask you to trade your if for action. It's in the action that the lepers truly met Jesus. The first 9 when they called out to Jesus, but that second one had a deeper, richer experience because he ran back to Jesus. It was an action-oriented faith. Here's what I believe. I believe that if you want to encounter Jesus, sometimes you will only encounter Jesus in action. I think Jesus will meet you in that action. I do. I believe that it could be revolutionary and life-changing. I believe that you want that encounter with something greater and something pure, something that's going to be gentle and restorative in your life that's going to help you come alive. And it's not always going to look like lights and smoke and loud music. I think sometimes we come to the worship experience with God and we're like, this is where we're going to meet Jesus. He's like, actually, I wanted to meet you outside the city. Sometimes I think we come into church and we're like, let's have it loud. Let's do the best that we can do, and we're gonna meet Jesus and worship. Sometimes, but sometimes it's not until you trade your if for action. Sometimes it's not until you respond to him that he actually meets you in it in a greater way. Sometimes you get the tip of the iceberg in the moments that we expect to meet Jesus, but it's not until we follow up and we come back to him, till we respond to his word, that we get the rest of the iceberg. And there's so much more beneath the surface. There's so much more beyond the need. I'm asking you today, regardless of where you fall in line with Jesus, just to try it. Just to try it. You might find that God is more than you ever anticipated he would be on the way. Let's pray.